Welcome to Moments in History Channel. Imagine it's 1967. The world is watching the Middle East, a region simmering with tension, like a pot about to boil over. In just 6 days, a war will erupt that reshapes the map, redefines power, and leaves a legacy that we are still grappling with today. This is the story of the Six-Day War, a conflict so swift and so decisive that its aftershocks are still felt across the globe. To truly understand what happened in June 1967, we need to rewind a bit. The State of Israel was less than 2 decades old, and its existence was a point of constant friction with its Arab neighbors. The years leading up to the war were marked by a drumbeat of rising hostility. There were border skirmishes, particularly with Syria, where artillery duels across the frontier were becoming dangerously common. Political rhetoric was heating up, with leaders on all sides delivering fiery speeches that only added fuel to the fire. It was an atmosphere of deep distrust and escalating fear. The immediate trigger, the spark that lit the fuse, came from Egypt, led by its charismatic and influential president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. In May 1967, Nasser made a series of moves that Israel interpreted as a direct preparation for war. First, he ordered the United Nations Emergency Force, a peacekeeping contingent that had been stationed in the Sinai Peninsula since the last major conflict in 1956, to withdraw. Their blue helmets had been a symbol of stability, a buffer between Egypt and Israel. Their sudden departure created a vacuum, and it felt like the final barrier to war had been removed. Then, Nasser moved about 100,000 Egyptian soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks into the now empty Sinai Peninsula, right up to Israel's border. The sight of this massive military buildup was deeply alarming for the Israelis. But the final straw was Nasser's next move. On May 22nd, he announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to all Israeli shipping and any ships bound for Israel's southern port of Eilat. For Israel, this was a crippling blow. The straits were its only maritime access to the Red Sea and, from there, to Africa and Asia. They saw it not just as an economic blockade, but as an act of war, a casus belli. From the Israeli perspective, the situation was dire. They were a small nation, surrounded by hostile armies that were larger and, on paper, more powerful. The rhetoric, coming from Arab capitals, spoke of wiping Israel off the map. The Israeli leadership, including Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, felt trapped. They believed that waiting for the Arab states to strike first would be suicidal. The element of surprise, they concluded, was their only chance for survival. They decided to act, and to act decisively. At 7:45 a.m. on Monday, June 5, 1967, Operation Focus was launched. In a stunning display of precision and audacity, virtually the entire Israeli Air Force took to the skies. Flying low to avoid radar detection and maintaining strict radio silence, waves of Israeli jets streaked across the Mediterranean before turning south toward Egypt. Their targets were Egypt's airfields. The Egyptian military was caught completely by surprise. Many of their pilots were still eating breakfast. Their advanced Soviet-made MiG and Tupolev aircraft were sitting exposed on the tarmac. In just under 3 hours, the Israeli attack was over. The results were devastating. Over 300 Egyptian aircraft, the vast majority of their air force, were destroyed. Most of them before they ever had a chance to take off. The runways were cratered, rendering them useless. With this single preemptive strike, Israel had achieved total air superiority. They now controlled the skies over the entire region. This would prove to be the single most decisive factor in the war. Without air cover, the Arab armies on the ground would be incredibly vulnerable to Israeli air attacks for the remainder of the conflict. With the Egyptian Air Force neutralized, Israel's ground forces stormed into the Sinai Peninsula. The plan was a 3-pronged assault, designed to encircle and destroy the Egyptian army. Commanded by generals like Israel Tal, Avraham Yoff, and Ariel Sharon, Israeli armored divisions punched through Egyptian defensive lines. The Egyptian soldiers, now without any protection from the air, were relentlessly pounded by the Israeli Air Force. Their command and control structures quickly fell apart. Communications broke down, and panic began to set in. What was intended to be a strategic defense by the Egyptians turned into a chaotic and desperate retreat. The Sinai Desert, with its vast open terrain, became a death trap. Israeli tanks and jets pursued the fleeing Egyptian forces, inflicting heavy casualties and destroying hundreds of tanks and other military vehicles. The roads were littered with the burning wreckage of the once mighty Egyptian army. In just 4 days of fighting, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, had swept across the entire Sinai Peninsula, reaching the Suez Canal. Egypt had suffered a catastrophic defeat. While the main event was unfolding in the Sinai, another front was opening up to the east. King Hussein of Jordan had a defense pact with Egypt. Misled by Nasser, who falsely claimed that the Egyptian army was crushing the Israelis and that Egyptian bombers were attacking Tel Aviv, King Hussein decided to enter the war. He hoped to relieve pressure on Egypt and perhaps make territorial gains of his own. On the morning of June 5th, Jordanian forces began shelling West Jerusalem and other Israeli towns. This was a fateful decision. Israel had initially sent a message to King Hussein through the UN, urging him to stay out of the conflict. But once the shelling began, Israel responded with overwhelming force. The battle for Jerusalem was particularly intense and symbolic. It was fought street by street, house by house. Israeli paratroopers were tasked with capturing the eastern part of the city, including the historic Old City, which housed some of the most sacred sites for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. After fierce fighting, on June 7th, Israeli forces broke through the Lion's Gate and captured the Old City. The emotional scenes of Israeli soldiers reaching the Western Wall, the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, were broadcast around the world. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, this holy site was under Jewish control. Beyond Jerusalem, Israeli forces moved swiftly through the rest of the West Bank, an area that had been under Jordanian rule since 1948. They captured key cities like Nablus, Hebron, and Jericho, and by the end of the fighting, the entire West Bank was under Israeli control. Jordan's brief, ill-fated entry into the war had ended in the loss of a huge swathe of its territory. Now we turn to the northern front. For years, Syria had used its strategic position on the Golan Heights to shell Israeli farms and communities in the valley below. The Golan is a high, rocky plateau that overlooks northern Israel, giving anyone who controls it a massive military advantage. Syrian forces were heavily fortified there, with a complex network of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions built into the rugged terrain. It was considered an almost impregnable fortress. For the first few days of the war, the northern front was relatively quiet, with mostly artillery exchanges. Israel was focused on Egypt and Jordan. But with those fronts secured, and with Syrian shelling continuing, the Israeli command turned its attention to the Golan. An assault on the heights was a daunting prospect. It would mean a frontal, uphill attack against a well-entrenched enemy. There was a heated debate within the Israeli leadership. Some, like Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, were initially hesitant, fearing heavy casualties. However, the pressure to remove the Syrian threat once and for all was immense. On June 9th, the 5th day of the war, the order was given. Israeli brigades began their difficult ascent up the steep slopes of the Golan. The fighting was brutal. Syrian defenders fought back fiercely, but once again, Israeli air superiority played a crucial role. Israeli jets pounded the Syrian positions, disrupting their command and sowing confusion. On the ground, Israeli engineering corps worked tirelessly to clear minefields and create paths for the tanks. Slowly but surely, the Israeli forces clawed their way up the heights. By the morning of June 10th, the Syrian defensive lines began to collapse. As Israeli tanks broke through and began to race across the plateau toward the city of Quneitra, the Syrian army fell into a full-scale retreat. By the time a UN-brokered ceasefire took effect that evening, Israel was in complete control of the Golan Heights. The constant threat of shelling from above had been eliminated, and just like that, it was over. In 6 short days, from June 5th to June 10th, 1967, the Middle East had been turned upside down. Israel had achieved one of the most decisive victories in modern military history. Against the combined armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, Israel had not only survived, but had expanded dramatically. The territorial changes were staggering. Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. In less than a week, it had tripled the amount of territory under its control. The military victory was absolute, but the consequences were complex and far-reaching. The Six-Day War shattered the dream of pan-Arab unity that Nasser had championed. It left a deep sense of humiliation and anger in the Arab world, which would fuel future conflicts, including the Yom Kippur War 6 years later. For the Israelis, the victory brought a sense of euphoria and security, but also a new set of problems. They were now administering a large, hostile Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. This occupation would become one of the most intractable and central issues in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war also reshaped international diplomacy. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, in exchange for termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area. This land for peace formula would become the bedrock of all future peace negotiations, but its ambiguous wording has been a source of endless debate ever since. Over half a century later, the legacy of those 6 days in June 1967 is everywhere. The status of Jerusalem, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the control of the Golan Heights, and the blockade of Gaza are all direct consequences of this short, transformative war. It created a new geopolitical reality, and the quest for a lasting peace in the shadow of its outcome continues to this day. The Six-Day War wasn't just a week of fighting. It was a week that defined the future of the Middle East. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this historical deep dive interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Moments in History channel for more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.